Title: Whispers in the Dark. Chapter 1: The First Whisper. Daniel had always been a man of reason. A mathematician by trade, he valued logic, structure, and certainty. His life with Grace had been simple, quiet, and predictable, much like the life he had always wanted. But it was the mundanity of their days together that had, in some strange way, lulled him into complacency. It was the kind of life where every morning greeted him with the same familiar sound, the gentle hum of the coffee machine, the clink of silverware against plates, and Grace's soft humming as she prepared breakfast in the kitchen. There was comfort in this routine, a predictability that Daniel had come to depend on. He hadn't realized how much he'd relied on that until it all began to change. It started with something so subtle that, at first, he couldn't even pinpoint the moment when things began to unravel. It was on an evening just like any other. They'd gone to bed at their usual time, Grace curling up next to him with a sigh, the soft weight of her body a constant reassurance. The light from the street lamp outside filtered through the curtains, casting a faint glow across the room. Daniel adjusted the pillow beneath his head and closed his eyes, the rhythmic sound of Grace's breathing soon lulling him into a restless sleep. But somewhere in the quiet of the night, something stirred. At first, it was nothing more than a faint murmur, a whisper so soft that Daniel wasn't sure if it was the wind or something else. He shifted, half-conscious, trying to ignore it, chalking it up to the strange noises that always seemed to occur at night. The house was old, after all, and the wood creaked and groaned with every shift in the wind. But then the whisper came again, louder this time. "They're watching." Daniel's heart skipped a beat. He lay perfectly still, staring into the darkness of the room. The whisper hadn't come from outside, but from beside him. It was Grace, her voice, but not her voice. It sounded wrong. The words were thick, muffled, as if they were coming from the bottom of a deep well. He strained to hear, but there was nothing more, just silence. His pulse raced as the unease in his stomach grew. Was she talking in her sleep? He had never known Grace to talk much in her sleep, and certainly never like this. She usually mumbled about trivial things that didn't make sense, misplaced thoughts or forgotten dreams. But this was different. This was something darker, something deeper. The whisper came again, this time clearer, as though it was being forced out of her by some unseen force. "They're watching us. They know you're here." Daniel's blood ran cold. He turned his head slowly toward Grace, watching her as she lay there, her face peaceful, her eyes closed in slumber. Her features were soft and calm, as though nothing was amiss, but he could feel the cold creeping in. He could feel the weight of the words she had just spoken, like a shiver down his spine. His mind raced as he tried to process it. Who was watching? What did she mean? He had to be imagining things, right? This couldn't be real. People talk in their sleep all the time. Maybe she had heard something earlier in the day, an unsettling news story, a conversation they'd had over dinner, and it had found its way into her dreams. But this wasn't just a random fragment of a dream. There was an urgency in her words, a sense of knowing, of something trying to reach him through the barrier of sleep. It wasn't just the content of what she was saying, it was the feeling behind it, a coldness, a presence. He lay awake, listening to her breathe, waiting for any sign of another whisper. But the room remained silent. Sleep, however, was elusive that night. Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, something irreparable. The words from her sleep lingered in his mind like a forgotten melody. "They know you're here." The next day, everything appeared normal. Grace made breakfast, just like she always did. The sun filtered through the windows, casting warm rays across the kitchen table. She hummed a soft tune to herself, her hands moving in the rhythmic motions she had perfected over the years. To anyone who looked, it was the picture of domestic tranquility. But Daniel couldn't shake the memory of the night before. The words, the feeling. He watched her closely, studying her as she moved around the kitchen, trying to find any trace of something amiss. But there was nothing, just the same Grace he had always known. She was here, with him, just as she had always been. Still, he couldn't get the whispers out of his mind. As the day wore on, he found himself listening more closely to her voice. Every time she spoke, he felt a strange unease settle in his chest, as if her words were somehow heavier than they should be. Was he imagining things? Or was something truly wrong? That night, it happened again. They were in bed, the room dark except for the faint glow of the moon casting shadows across the walls. Grace was already asleep, curled against him, her breathing slow and steady. Daniel had hoped that the events of the previous night had just been a figment of his imagination, but as he closed his eyes, he found himself straining to listen. And then, just as before, he heard it. "They're coming." It was barely a whisper, but it sent a chill through his bones. Daniel lay still, his heart pounding in his chest. He tried to convince himself that he was overreacting. It was just a dream, just a trick of the mind, but the whisper continued. "They're coming for you." His breath caught in his throat. This time there was no mistaking it. He could hear the urgency in her voice, the desperation that had been absent the first time. He could hear it now, louder than before, as if something was trying to get his attention. He turned to face her, his eyes wide with fear, but Grace remained still, her face relaxed and serene. She was sound asleep, her lips barely moving, the words coming from her as if she were not even aware of them. Daniel's skin prickled. What was happening to her? What had caused her to speak like this? Was she dreaming? Or was there something else at play? He had to know. He couldn't let this go on. For the next few nights, Daniel lay awake, listening intently as Grace spoke in her sleep. It wasn't just a random mumble or a string of disjointed words. It was coherent, deliberate. It was as if someone or something was trying to communicate through her. The whispers started to form a pattern, a message that Daniel couldn't understand. Every night Grace would speak of something new. Places they had never visited, people they had never met, things Daniel had never thought to ask her about. She mentioned streets they had driven down in the past, places they had lived before, and towns he had only heard of in passing. But there was one phrase that kept repeating itself, haunting him. "They're coming for you." It didn't make sense. Who was coming? What did she mean? And why was she speaking of these things in her sleep? Daniel's unease grew, but he couldn't bring himself to wake her, to interrupt the strange and unsettling monologue that seemed to flow from her mouth every night. He was afraid of what she might say, afraid of what she might reveal. As the days passed, Daniel became consumed by the whispers. He could no longer sleep soundly, not with the constant fear of hearing those words again. And every night, as Grace's sleep-talking grew more frequent and more detailed, he began to question his own sanity. Was he losing his mind? Or was something far worse at play? Something dark, something ancient, something waiting. And so, as the nights wore on, Daniel found himself caught between the warmth of his love for his wife and the gnawing terror that was slowly consuming him. The house, once a sanctuary, now felt like a prison. The walls seemed to close in around him, and the shadows grew deeper, darker. Every whisper Grace uttered felt like a warning, a countdown to something inevitable. He didn't know how much longer he could live like this. But one thing was certain. Whatever was speaking through Grace was not something he could ignore. It was coming, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Chapter 2. The Unseen Presence. Daniel had always believed that the world worked in logical patterns, that everything had an explanation, something scientific, tangible. There was no room in his mind for the fantastical, the absurd. But something had begun to gnaw at him, pulling at the very fabric of his understanding of reality. And no matter how hard he tried to ignore it, to push it down into the recesses of his mind, it only grew stronger with each passing day. The whispers had started innocuously enough, almost like the remnants of a dream. But as time wore on, they became more insistent, more demanding. And now, they had become his only thoughts. He could feel them even in the daylight, seeping through the cracks of his mind, whispering to him like a forbidden secret. It was during the quiet of the afternoon when it hit him hardest. Grace was sitting at the kitchen table, sipping her tea, and humming the same tune she always did. The light from the window bathed her in a soft golden glow, and for a moment, Daniel found himself lost in the tranquility of it all. But the peace was fleeting, like a delicate mirage vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. Grace's eyes shifted toward him, and she smiled faintly. It was a kind smile, a reassuring smile. But there was something hollow in it now, something Daniel couldn't place. He swallowed hard and forced a smile in return. He tried to focus on her, on the familiarity of her presence, but the whispering voice in his head wouldn't let him. "They're watching," the voice murmured again, this time far more distinct, like a soft breeze brushing against his ear. "They're always watching." Daniel jerked his gaze to the corner of the room, his breath catching in his throat. There was nothing there, of course. Just the usual domestic clutter, the untouched stack of mail on the counter, a half-full glass of water, a chair that had been slightly pulled out from the table. But in that moment, it felt as though the walls themselves were alive, listening, waiting. He looked back at Grace, forcing himself to meet her eyes. She hadn't noticed his growing discomfort, too absorbed in her thoughts, her gaze distant. "Did you say something?" he asked, his voice tight. Grace blinked, her smile fading just slightly. "What do you mean?" Her voice was soft, almost soothing, but there was something about her tone, something too detached, too unfamiliar, that sent a shiver down his spine. "Never mind." He shook his head, trying to brush it off. There was no sense in worrying her, no sense in acknowledging what was beginning to feel like an inescapable nightmare. He had to stay calm, to hold on to the fragments of his rationality that were beginning to slip away. But that night, as they both lay in bed, Daniel could hear it again, a murmur, a low, soft sound escaping Grace's lips as she slept. It was barely audible at first, but Daniel had learned by now to listen closely. His mind was far too awake for sleep, his body too restless to relax. "They're coming," she whispered, and her voice was clearer than it had ever been before. Daniel's heart pounded in his chest. He turned his head slowly, trying not to disturb her. Grace's face was peaceful, her eyes closed in slumber. She appeared innocent, like she always did. But the words were unmistakable. They weren't random this time. They weren't just fragmented, disconnected thoughts. These words were coherent, deliberate, like a message, an ominous prediction. "They're coming. For you." Daniel's pulse quickened. A cold sweat broke out across his brow, but he didn't move. He didn't dare. His breath hitched as he listened to the words again and again in his mind. "They're coming for you." Was it a nightmare? Some sort of sleep-induced hallucination? His logical mind wanted to dismiss it, but there was something about the cadence of her voice that made him pause. Something about the way she spoke that felt wrong, as if the words were not truly hers, but forced out by some unseen presence. The next morning, Grace awoke as though nothing had happened. She stretched, yawning softly, and then smiled at Daniel as she always did. "Good morning." But to Daniel, everything felt different. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. Her voice sounded flat, distant, like a recording he had heard too many times. He couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that she was no longer the same. She had never spoken like this before. And the whispers, they had only gotten worse, more vivid, more insistent. That day, Daniel spent his time obsessively replaying the events of the previous night in his mind. Was he imagining things? Was it just the stress of his job or the late nights that were making him paranoid? He couldn't bring himself to believe it. Not when the fear was so palpable, so suffocating. But he knew he couldn't ignore it anymore. Something had awakened within Grace. Something dark and ancient. And Daniel was starting to believe that whatever it wasn't something that would let them go so easily. Matzo Pabi. As the days went by, the whispers became harder to ignore. They seeped into every corner of Daniel's life. Even during the day, he began to hear faint murmurs in the background, whispers too soft to understand, but unmistakable in their presence. He found himself jumping at shadows, unable to trust the silence that had once been so comforting. One evening, after a particularly long day at work, Daniel came home to find the house eerily quiet. Grace wasn't in the kitchen, nor was she in the living room. A strange sensation crept over him as he stood in the doorway, listening to the silence. It was almost too quiet, as if the house itself were holding its breath. He walked through the house, calling out her name. When he reached the bedroom, he found her standing by the window, staring out into the night. The moonlight cast a cold, ghostly glow across her face, making her look distant, almost otherworldly. "Grace?" he called softly, his voice trembling slightly. She didn't respond. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, as if listening to something only she could hear. "They're here," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Daniel's heart clenched in his chest. "Who's here?" he demanded, his voice rising in panic. Grace turned slowly, her expression vacant, her eyes wide and unblinking. "They've been here all along, waiting." Daniel stepped closer, reaching out to touch her arm, but she recoiled as if the touch burned her. "They're watching," she said, her voice colder now, sharper. "They've been watching us. Always watching." Before Daniel could say another word, Grace's gaze snapped back toward the window, her body stiffening. And as he looked out into the darkness, he couldn't help but feel that something was out there. Something that wasn't supposed to be. Chapter 2. The Unseen Presence. Expanded. Daniel had always been a man of reason, a person who relied on logic to navigate the world. His life had been built on the belief that everything had an explanation. People did things for reasons, even if those reasons were sometimes not clear. But recently, things had begun to slip, like a thread unraveling from a fabric that had once seemed so tightly woven. The whispers, the odd moments with Grace, the deep sense of dread that clung to him. None of it made sense, and yet it all felt so real. It wasn't supposed to be like this. He had married Grace because she was his anchor, the calm in his often chaotic life. But the calm had started to crack, revealing something else, something darker, something that haunted him in ways he couldn't quite understand. He had to stop, he told himself. He had to let go of the fear, had to focus on what he knew to be true. Grace was the woman he loved, and whatever was happening could be explained away by stress or exhaustion. But deep down, Daniel knew this was no longer a simple case of overworked nerves. The whispers had grown louder. At first, it had been nothing more than the occasional hushed murmur, soft and fleeting, like a sound just on the edge of his hearing. Daniel would lie awake at night, tossing and turning, only to hear the voice. Faint, indistinct, almost drowned out by the hum of the house. But over the past week, the voice had become clearer, more insistent, cutting through the stillness of the night like a knife. It was always the same words. "They're watching." Every time he heard it, he would glance over at Grace. She would be asleep, her body still and quiet, unaware of the chilling murmurs that echoed through his mind. "They're watching. Always watching. Waiting." Daniel had tried to dismiss it at first. He reasoned that the stress of work, the pressures of daily life, must have been playing tricks on him. After all, he had always been a rational man. But the truth was, every time he heard those words, they sank deeper into his psyche, gnawing at his thoughts. It wasn't just the voice, it was the feeling that came with it, the presence. Something was there, something unseen and suffocating. One evening after dinner, Daniel found himself standing by the kitchen window, staring out at the darkening world. The wind had picked up, rustling the trees outside, and the sky was a deep purple, the last traces of daylight slipping away. The house had grown cold, and Daniel couldn't shake the sense that something wasn't right. He thought he saw something in the shadows, just for a split second, but when he blinked, it was gone. He turned back to the kitchen, his heart racing. Grace was sitting at the table, absent-mindedly stirring her tea. Her hair was loose around her shoulders, and the soft glow from the lamp above cast a warm, comforting light over her. Yet, in the back of his mind, he knew something had changed. He knew that she wasn't the same anymore. He stood frozen for a moment, watching her, as the sound of her spoon scraping against the side of the mug echoed in his ears. It felt loud, too loud. His mind was no longer focusing on the simple act of her drinking tea. No, his mind was spinning, trapped in a web of paranoia. The whispers were getting louder. They were moving beyond his thoughts, shifting into his reality. "They're coming." The words came again, this time louder, as though the whispers had slipped from his mind into the very air around him. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. He turned quickly to face Grace, as though trying to snap himself out of the trance he had fallen into. But she hadn't noticed. She continued to stir her tea, her face blank, her eyes focused on nothing in particular. "Grace." Daniel's voice was shaky, though he tried to keep it steady. "Did you hear that?" She blinked, her gaze flickering up to him, as if she had just come out of a daze. "Hear what?" Her voice was calm, soothing even, but it lacked warmth. It was almost too detached. There was something about her tone, something unnervingly indifferent. He hesitated. He wanted to tell her everything, the whispers, the sense of dread that was growing inside him. But how could he? How could he explain something that didn't make sense? Something that had no foundation in the reality they shared? "Never mind," Daniel said finally, though the words tasted bitter on his tongue. "I'm just tired." But he wasn't just tired. He was scared. Scared of what was happening to her. Scared of what was happening to him. That night, after Grace had gone to bed, Daniel lay awake, his mind swirling with thoughts. His eyes scanned the room, watching the shadows shift in the corners of the room as the moonlight filtered through the curtains. He knew he should sleep, but every time he closed his eyes, the whispers would come. They slithered through his thoughts, their words so clear now. "They're coming for you. You can't escape." Suddenly, he heard it, a sound, faint but unmistakable, like the flutter of pages in the stillness of the night. It came from the direction of the bedroom door. Daniel's heart stopped. He didn't move, didn't breathe. He just listened. The sound came again, and this time, he was sure it wasn't in his head. He could hear footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing from the hallway. He told himself it was just the house settling, the creak of old floorboards, but deep down, he knew that wasn't it. These footsteps were different. There was something purposeful about them, something ominous. He held his breath, straining his ears to catch the next sound. But there was nothing. The house was silent once more. No more footsteps. No more whispers. It was all in his mind, he told himself. It had to be. But even as he thought this, he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. He could feel it, an unseen presence standing just behind him, watching, waiting. He turned quickly, but there was nothing there, just the dim outline of Grace's form in the bed beside him. Her back turned toward him. But then she spoke, and Daniel's blood ran cold. "They're here," she whispered, her voice a hoarse murmur in the dark. He froze. "Grace?" Her body was still. Her breath was shallow, steady. She wasn't awake, but the words had been so clear, so deliberate. "They're here, Daniel. They've been here all along. They've been watching us." Daniel felt his stomach churn. This wasn't just sleep talking. This wasn't just a product of exhaustion. The words were too specific, too knowing. It felt as if Grace was speaking from somewhere deep inside, from some hidden place that Daniel could never reach. He lay back down slowly, trying to control his breathing, but his heart raced in his chest. He was scared. He was terrified. And for the first time, he didn't know what to do. He didn't know who to trust. The whispers were right. They were coming. As the days passed, Daniel's unease only deepened. The house, once a place of comfort, now felt suffocating. The air was thick with an energy he couldn't place. The whispers were everywhere. When he woke up, when he tried to sleep, even during the daylight hours, they followed him, burrowing deep into his thoughts, their presence undeniable. Grace's sleep-talking grew more vivid, more disturbing. The words she spoke were no longer vague, fleeting fragments. They were specific, about people he didn't know, about places he'd never been. "They're here. They're coming for you." And all the while, Grace appeared unaware of it all. She smiled at him, spoke to him as if nothing was wrong, but the distance between them was growing wider. Something was slipping between them, a chasm that neither could cross. One evening, Daniel decided to confront her. He couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine. "Grace, we need to talk," he said softly, as they sat in the living room, the shadows of night creeping in through the windows. She looked at him, her eyes wide and blank, like a doll with no soul behind the gaze. "About what?" Daniel swallowed, trying to keep his voice steady. "About what's been happening. About what you've been saying at night." Grace blinked, her expression faltering for a brief moment. But then she smiled. It was a strange smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I don't remember what I say at night, Daniel. You know that." He shook his head. "No, this is different. You've been talking about things that don't make sense. Things that—" He couldn't finish. The words caught in his throat. But Grace just stared at him, her smile never faltering, her eyes cold. "It doesn't matter, Daniel. They've always been here. They've been with us from the beginning." Daniel's breath caught in his throat. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't understand. "Who are you?" he whispered. And in that moment, the silence in the room seemed to deepen, the walls closing in on him. Chapter 3. The Silent Visitor. Daniel could no longer ignore the creeping sense of dread that had taken root in the corners of his mind. The house, which had once felt like a sanctuary, now felt like a prison. The whispers had escalated in volume, no longer limited to his thoughts, but beginning to manifest in the very air around him. And Grace, his beloved wife, was changing. The once warm affection in her eyes had given way to something colder, something unsettling. It was as if a shadow now lived within her, lurking beneath her skin, whispering things he couldn't understand. The first incident came 2 nights ago. Daniel had been lying awake, staring at the ceiling, the moonlight filtering through the curtains in pale stripes across the room. He tried to convince himself it was just a phase, stress perhaps, or his mind playing tricks on him. But that thought did nothing to quiet the growing unease that gnawed at him. His thoughts turned again to Grace. She lay beside him, her breathing steady, her body still. He wanted to reach out, to hold her, to feel the warmth of her touch. But as his hand hovered over the bed, a feeling stopped him, a feeling like an invisible hand gripping his chest, tightening with every passing second. He could no longer breathe. He drew his hand back, heart hammering in his chest, but the pressure never left. The air around him felt thick, heavy, like it was filled with something else. He sat up, his gaze darting toward Grace. The shadows in the room seemed to gather in her direction, clinging to her like a cloak. She hadn't moved, her face serene, almost ethereal. But then, it happened. It was almost imperceptible at first, a small shift in the bed. But then it came again, and again, a sound. Not a noise he could describe, but a deep, vibrating sensation that seemed to pulse from her side of the bed, reverberating through the air, through the walls, through his very bones. Daniel's breath caught in his throat as he watched her. Her eyes remained closed, but her lips began to move, slowly, as if she were speaking in her sleep. But no words came out, not at first. Just an incoherent mumbling, something unintelligible. And then the words broke through, clear as day. "They're watching. They're coming. You can't hide from them." Daniel's blood ran cold. His entire body stiffened, paralyzed by the sound of her voice. It wasn't a normal sleep-talking episode. This was different. This was deliberate, purposeful. The cold sweat on his skin only grew as he realized the nature of her words. She wasn't just murmuring nonsense. She was speaking with the kind of clarity that only the living could understand. And it was someone else inside her, manipulating her, controlling her. He reached out, his trembling hand brushing against her shoulder. "Grace," he whispered, his voice breaking. She stirred slightly, but did not wake. Her breathing remained steady, as if nothing had happened. But Daniel knew. He knew that something had shifted in her, something that couldn't be explained away by stress or a bad dream. The whispers had found a new vessel. The next day, Daniel tried to approach the subject carefully. He knew Grace wouldn't remember what had happened, but the unease still lingered, hanging in the air like a persistent fog. "Grace," he began, his voice quiet, careful. "Last night, you said something. In your sleep. Her face didn't change. She glanced up from her book, the corner of her mouth lifting in a smile. "Oh, was I talking in my sleep again?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. Her nonchalant reaction felt too ordinary, too out of place. How could she act so casual about it? Didn't she realize the gravity of what she had said? "It wasn't just nonsense, Grace," he said, his voice tinged with frustration. "You were saying things. You said, 'They're watching.' You said, 'They're coming.'" Grace's smile faltered, but only for a moment. Her eyes fluttered briefly before meeting his gaze again. "That's strange. I don't remember saying anything like that." Daniel wanted to reach out, to shake her, to make her understand the weight of the words, but he didn't. Instead, he nodded slowly, an uneasy feeling spreading through his chest. "You've been acting differently," he said, the words escaping his lips before he could stop them. "I don't know how to explain it, but you're different." Grace didn't seem offended. Instead, she looked almost curious. There was a strange light in her eyes, something cold, something distant. "Maybe you're just stressed, Daniel. You've been working too hard. You're imagining things." Her voice was gentle, but there was a finality to her words, as if the conversation was over. Daniel could feel the distance between them growing wider, a gap that neither of them could cross. He had always known Grace to be gentle, kind, and warm. But now something was wrong. He could feel it deep in his gut. Sut. Later that night, Daniel lay in bed, unable to sleep. The whispers had returned, louder this time, echoing in his mind, rattling his thoughts. He tried to push them away, but they wouldn't leave. He reached over to the bedside lamp, flicking it on, but the sudden light did little to push away the darkness. It was as if the shadows were alive, feeding on his fear, growing stronger in the corners of the room. Grace, once again, slept peacefully beside him, her face serene, her chest rising and falling in the gentle rhythm of sleep. But there was something off about her, something that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. The house felt alive, watching, waiting. For the first time in his life, Daniel felt truly alone. The room seemed to close in on him, the air thick with an oppressive energy. He turned his head toward Grace, his pulse racing. It felt like the room was shifting, changing. The shadows danced along the walls, and he swore, for a fleeting moment, that he saw a figure standing in the doorway. But when he blinked, it was gone. "Grace!" His voice was shaky, barely a whisper. She stirred, her eyes flicking open for a moment. But instead of the warm, loving gaze he was used to, all he saw was a blank emptiness. Her lips moved, slowly, silently, as though she were trying to speak but couldn't. And then, just as quickly, she closed her eyes again, the peaceful expression returning to her face. Daniel sat up, his heart pounding. He couldn't stay here, couldn't lie next to her anymore. Something wasn't right, something far beyond sleep talking, beyond mere stress. This was no longer about his fears or his imagination. It was something real. He got out of bed, his movements hurried and frantic, and hurried down the stairs into the kitchen. He needed to clear his mind, to think. But as he reached for the light switch, he froze. There, standing in the doorway, was Grace. Her hair hung in tangled knots around her face, her clothes wrinkled as if she had been standing there for hours. Her eyes were wide, staring into the dark, unblinking. "Grace?" She didn't respond. Her lips barely moved, but he heard the words, low, haunting, as if they were being whispered by something else, something far older than anything human. "They're already here, Daniel. You cannot escape them." Her voice was cold, hollow, distant. It was no longer his Grace standing before him. The woman in front of him was a stranger, an empty shell inhabited by something far worse. And as her cold, empty eyes met his, Daniel realized he was no longer alone. The thing in his house had finally made its presence known, and it was wearing the face of his wife. As the days stretched into weeks, Daniel grew more paranoid. The presence in the house had begun to manifest more frequently. He would hear footsteps in the halls at night, see strange shadows lurking in the corners of his vision, but whenever he turned to look, they would vanish. Grace's sleep-talking had only grown more cryptic, more disturbing. Sometimes she would mutter in her sleep, something about eyes watching them, about being trapped. Other times she would speak with a calm, eerie precision, recounting things that had never happened, events that only someone from beyond could know. The more Daniel tried to ignore it, the stronger the presence became. The thing in their house wasn't just a figment of his imagination. It was real, and it was getting closer. The line between reality and nightmare began to blur, and Daniel could no longer trust his own mind. There was something watching them, waiting for them to make a mistake. And as Grace's behavior grew more erratic, more alien, Daniel was beginning to wonder if they were already too late. Could they escape? Or had they already been claimed by whatever dark force now held sway over their lives? He wasn't sure anymore, but one thing was certain: the shadows weren't just watching, they were closing in. Chapter 4. The Unseen Hand. The house was quiet, but it was a silence that felt suffocating, like the weight of an unspoken truth was pressing down on every surface, every shadow. Daniel hadn't slept in days. Every time he closed his eyes, he felt the oppressive atmosphere of the house closing in on him, pushing him into the darkness of his own mind. It wasn't the house that haunted him, it was Grace, his wife, the woman he had loved, the woman he had promised to spend his life with. But now, every time he looked at her, every time he heard her speak in her sleep, he felt as though he was staring at a stranger, and still, she seemed unaware of the transformation. Her eyes remained blank, distant, as if the person he had once known had been replaced by something colder, something far more sinister. Grace's behavior had become more erratic, unpredictable. One moment, she would laugh softly in her sleep. The next, she would begin muttering incoherently, her words tumbling out in quick, disjointed phrases. He tried to confront her, tried to ask if she remembered the things she said in the night, but she always brushed him off with a smile and a soft laugh, telling him it was nothing. But Daniel knew better. He couldn't ignore it anymore. This wasn't just sleep-talking. This wasn't just a bad dream. The darkness in the house was growing stronger. It began one evening, just after the sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the world bathed in an eerie twilight. Daniel was sitting in the living room, his mind racing with thoughts he couldn't escape, when he heard a soft thud from upstairs. His heart skipped a beat as he froze, his gaze snapping toward the staircase. The sound wasn't loud, just a small, insignificant noise, almost like a footstep on carpet. But it was enough to send a shiver up his spine. He had heard that sound before, many times. It was the same sound that had woken him up countless nights. It was the sound of someone, something, moving in the dark. He stood up slowly, his legs trembling beneath him. He knew he shouldn't investigate. He knew it was futile. But something inside him, something primal, told him he couldn't ignore it any longer. He had to know what was happening. He had to confront whatever was haunting them. He walked toward the stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. The house was unnaturally still, the air thick with tension. As he ascended the stairs, he felt the presence around him. It wasn't just the shadows. It was something more, something intangible, that seemed to wrap itself around his chest, squeezing the air from his lungs. The farther he went, the tighter the pressure became. When he reached the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched before him in perfect darkness. His fingers brushed the wall as he moved forward, the old wallpaper cool beneath his fingertips. The house seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for something. At the end of the hallway, he saw a faint light flickering under the door to their bedroom. His heart pounded in his chest. He knew what that meant. He knew that Grace had to be in there. But why was the light on? She never left it on at night. With a quiet breath, he pushed open the door. As the room was bathed in the soft flickering glow of the bedside lamp, Grace lay on the bed, her eyes closed, her body perfectly still, but there was something wrong. Her chest wasn't rising and falling with the rhythm of sleep. No, her body was unnaturally still, almost too still, as if she were not breathing at all. Daniel's breath hitched in his throat. He rushed to her side, shaking her gently. "Grace? Grace, wake up! His voice trembled with fear, but she didn't stir. He pressed his hand to her chest, feeling for the familiar rise and fall of her breathing. His hand came away cold. There was no heartbeat, no warmth, just nothing. A flood of panic surged through him, and for a moment he thought he might scream. But then, just as quickly, the tension in the room shifted. The temperature seemed to drop, the air turning icy cold, and Grace's eyes snapped open. They weren't her eyes. The once warm brown pupils that Daniel had known so well had become black, empty, soulless voids. Her lips parted, and for the first time since this nightmare began, she spoke. "It's too late now, Daniel." Her voice was not her own. It was distant, detached, as if it had come from somewhere far away, from something far older. A dark chill swept over Daniel, and he staggered back, his mind reeling. What do you mean? Grace, please. This isn't you." But she didn't respond. She simply sat up in bed, her movements unnaturally slow, as though her body was no longer fully under her control. Her mouth moved again, but the words she spoke were a jumble of broken sentences, gibberish that made no sense. "They're waiting. They've always been waiting. The house isn't empty, Daniel. It's never been empty." The words sent a sharp pang of dread through his chest. His throat tightened, and he could hardly breathe. The whispers from the night before flooded back to him, but now they were clearer, louder. He could almost hear them around him, in the walls, in the very air. They were closing in. Before he could react, Grace's body suddenly twisted, her head jerking at an unnatural angle. The movement was too fast, too violent. Daniel stumbled backward, his legs nearly giving out beneath him. He watched in horror as Grace's mouth stretched open wide, wider than any human mouth should be able to, and then, with a deep, guttural voice, she whispered words that made Daniel's blood run cold. "You can't hide from them. They'll take everything." A heavy thud reverberated through the room, as if something enormous was shifting in the walls. The lights flickered violently, casting grotesque shadows that seemed to dance and stretch across the room. The air felt thick and suffocating, and Daniel's chest tightened with the pressure of it. He had to get out. He had to leave. But Grace, no, whatever this was not letting him go. The air around him grew heavier, as if invisible hands were pressing down on his shoulders, forcing him to stay. "Grace!" His voice was barely a whisper, filled with fear and disbelief. "Please wake up. Whatever this is, please come back to me." But there was no response. Grace's body was still. Her eyes remained wide, her pupils now large, almost completely black, swallowing everything in their path. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the house went silent again. The lights flickered one last time, and Grace's eyes slowly returned to normal. Her lips closed, and she fell back into the bed, her body limp, as though nothing had happened. Her breathing returned to its normal, steady rhythm, and Daniel's heart pounded in his chest, unsure whether to believe what had just occurred. For a moment, he thought maybe he had imagined it. Maybe it had all been some sort of horrific nightmare. But when he looked down at his trembling hands, he knew it wasn't. He could still feel the cold pressure, the presence that had gripped him so tightly. And then, as he glanced at Grace once more, he saw it. Just for a fleeting moment, the faintest shadow passed over her face. Something old, something dark. And Daniel realized with growing horror that whatever had taken his wife was not finished. It was only beginning. In the days that followed, Daniel struggled to make sense of what had happened. Grace had returned to her usual self, or so it seemed. She didn't remember anything from that night. In fact, she seemed to act like nothing unusual had occurred at all. But Daniel could feel it. He could feel the presence, the weight of the unseen hand that seemed to be closing in on them. And as the days wore on, he began to notice something else. The house was changing. Things would move when no one was around. Shadows would linger longer than they should. And the whispers, oh, the whispers, they never stopped. They were always there, always watching, always waiting. Grace was no longer the woman he had married. She had become something else, something darker, something that was not entirely her. And Daniel despite his fear, couldn't escape the growing sense that it was only a matter of time before whatever was inside her completely took over. The question was, would it take him too? Chapter 5. The Shadows Between Us. Daniel could feel the air change the moment he stepped inside the house again. The once familiar walls that had sheltered him and Grace for so many months now seemed alien, foreign. The warmth had gone, leaving behind a cold, suffocating chill that clung to the very fabric of the house. It was as though the house had been waiting for this, waiting for him to return to its dark embrace. He hadn't spoken to anyone since the night Grace disappeared. He wasn't sure whether she had truly disappeared, or if she had become something else, something that only existed in the spaces between this world and the next. The house had taken her. That much he knew. The house, and something darker, something that had been feeding off their fear, their memories, their very souls. Daniel's footsteps echoed through the hallway, each step louder than the last. He reached the living room, but the sight before him caused his stomach to churn. The air was thick with the stench of decay, as if something had been rotting in the walls for years. The furniture, once neat and comforting, now seemed disordered, as though they had been disturbed by unseen hands. He had only come back to retrieve his things. He needed to leave, but his mind was clouded with the confusion of what had happened, and the strange pull of the house kept him anchored here, as if it were calling to him, whispering his name in voices too faint for the living to hear. The house had always been quiet, but now the silence felt like a warning. It was not the kind of silence one experiences when everyone is asleep, but the kind of silence that precedes something terrible, something ancient. As he reached the kitchen, his eyes fell on the dark stains that covered the floor. Red, the same shade as the roses Grace had once loved so much. Hadn't she been the one who tended to the flowers out in the garden? But now, those flowers were gone. The garden was overgrown, wild, untamed, like the house itself. Daniel froze, staring at the blood-stained floor. His heart raced in his chest, his throat tight with panic. He wanted to turn away, to leave, but his legs felt heavy, as if the floor itself was holding him in place. The whispers began again, soft at first, like the wind stirring through the trees outside. But they grew louder, sharper, until it felt like they were pressing into his skull. "It's not over." The voice was faint, as if coming from behind the walls. It wasn't Grace's voice. It wasn't anyone's voice he recognized. It was hollow, echoing through his mind like the clattering of chains on the floor of a forgotten tomb. He stumbled backward, his hand clutching the edge of the counter as he fought to steady himself. The shadows in the corner of the room seemed to shift, almost imperceptibly, but there was no mistaking it. Something was moving in the darkness. Something was waiting. He had to get out. He had to escape, but the house was pulling him deeper, sucking him in like a whirlpool. Daniel's eyes fell to the floor again, where the bloodstains had begun to move, swirling in unnatural patterns, forming strange symbols he couldn't quite recognize. His pulse quickened as his mind tried to make sense of what he was seeing. But it wasn't the blood that terrified him. It was the faces emerging from the blood, screaming. He gasped, stumbling backward as the faces seemed to twist and writhe within the blood, contorting in unnatural ways. Their mouths opened wide in agony, their eyes pleading for release, but there was no escape. They were trapped in this place, just as Grace had been. Daniel could feel his sanity slipping. He turned away from the horrific sight and sprinted toward the door. But as his hand reached for the handle, a voice, faint and ragged, called out from behind him. "It's too late, Daniel. You can never leave." He froze. The voice came from the shadows, from the very depths of the house. The room seemed to darken even further, the corners of his vision stretching as if something were pushing against the edges of his mind, distorting everything in its path. His breath caught in his throat. It wasn't Grace. It wasn't anyone he knew. "You should never have come back," the voice whispered, a low, guttural growl that seemed to seep into his bones. Suddenly, everything went silent. The whispers, the faces, the voices, all of it vanished as if it had never existed. Daniel's chest heaved with fear, and for a brief, fleeting moment, he thought maybe he had imagined it all. Maybe it was the stress, the isolation. Maybe it wasn't real, but deep down he knew better. The house wasn't done with him. The house wasn't finished. He turned slowly, his heart hammering in his chest as he glanced over his shoulder. What he saw made his blood run cold. A figure stood at the far end of the hallway. It was Grace, or rather, it looked like Grace. Her hair hung in tangled knots, her skin pale and stretched too thin, her eyes wide and empty, but it wasn't her. Not anymore. The figure's body was still, rigid, like a puppet whose strings had been pulled too tightly, and the smell. It was a smell that he would never forget, rotting, like the very essence of death itself. The figure's mouth parted in a twisted, grotesque grin, but no words came. And then, in the darkness, the shadows began to move again, creeping along the walls, curling into the corners of the room like snakes. They were everywhere. They were closing in. You can't escape it. The voice came again, this time from all around him. It wasn't just the shadows. It was the walls. It was the very air he breathed. It was in the ground beneath his feet, in the house itself. He backed away, but it was too late. The door he had tried to reach moments before slammed shut with a deafening crash. The room went pitch black. Daniel's heart raced in his chest. He was trapped. The whispers came faster now, more frantic, more desperate. It's here, it's coming for you. You should never have returned. It wants you. The darkness swallowed him whole. He couldn't see, couldn't breathe, but he could feel it. Feel the cold touch of the shadows curling around his skin, wrapping around his body like chains. He heard her voice again. But this time it wasn't Grace. It was 1,000 voices, a chorus of agony and torment. We're waiting for you. Daniel closed his eyes, trembling uncontrollably. His entire body screamed for escape, but there was no way out. The house had claimed him. And then, the shadows surged. They rushed toward him, faster than he could comprehend, and everything went black. Chapter 5. The Final Resting Place. Daniel's mind reeled from the suffocating darkness that had swallowed him whole. For a moment, he wondered if he had somehow lost consciousness, or if he had entered a place beyond the world he knew, a place where the lines between life and death had blurred. The blackness around him was thick and suffocating, like the very air had turned to tar, heavy with something unexplainable. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't speak. There was only the presence, and it was growing. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat like a drum summoning an ancient evil, pulling him closer to the center of the house's malevolent grip. He wanted to scream, but his voice caught in his throat. His limbs felt as though they were frozen in place, bound by invisible chains. The suffocating feeling of terror was crushing him, forcing him deeper into the inescapable pull of the house. The walls felt like they were closing in, pressing on him from all sides, suffocating him. Suddenly, the darkness began to shift. Shapes emerged from the void, swirling into existence around him. Faces, dozens of faces. At first they were fleeting, little more than shadows that flashed past the edges of his vision, but then they grew clearer, more defined. Their mouths stretched wide in silent screams, eyes bulging in horror. They were all the same, the faces of people he had never met, all contorted by a suffering so deep, it twisted their very beings. Daniel's breath caught in his throat, as a voice, low and guttural, whispered in his ear from behind him. You shouldn't have come back. This is where you belong. His body trembled in response. He tried to move, but the weight of the shadows seemed to increase, pressing down on him like 1,000 hands. He wanted to shout, to break free, but his voice was lost in the suffocating stillness of the room. The oppressive darkness had taken hold of him completely. Then, just as he thought he might lose his mind entirely, the shadows receded, slightly, but enough for him to take in a new sight. Grace. Her body stood motionless before him, framed by the dim glow that had suddenly flickered into life. She was no longer the woman he had known, this thing that resembled her. Was it truly her? The Grace he had loved, the Grace he had tried to save, seemed to have been swallowed by the very darkness that had haunted this house. Her hair hung around her face in tangled clumps, her eyes empty, hollow black pits where once there had been warmth. Her mouth was slightly open, but no words came out. The pale skin of her face had been stretched tight, almost translucent, as if she were fading away before his very eyes. And the smell was overwhelming, decay, rot, and something far worse that he couldn't name. The air in the room grew colder. A sharp chill gripped Daniel's bones, making it feel as though the life was being sucked from him. He could see his breath cloud in front of him, but Grace's figure didn't seem to breathe at all. She stood there, silent, watching, waiting. "Grace," Daniel whispered, his voice hoarse and trembling. She didn't respond. She couldn't. Her eyes stayed locked on him, but there was no recognition in them. The figure before him wasn't his wife anymore. It was something else. Something other. A cold, distorted laugh echoed from the corners of the room. Daniel's heart skipped a beat, and he turned slowly. From the shadows, a new figure emerged. A figure that had been hidden, lurking, watching. It was the same inhuman entity he had sensed the first time he stepped into the house. A presence so malevolent, so ancient, that it seemed to be made from the very essence of nightmares. It wasn't human. No, it wasn't anything that could be considered human. The creature had the shape of a man, but its skin was pale and stretched taut, like a corpse that had been left too long in the sun. Its eyes were two black pits, and its mouth was a gaping maw full of sharp, jagged teeth. Its limbs were unnaturally long, reaching down to the floor, its fingers twisted and clawed. "Grace!" the creature hissed, its voice gravelly and cold. "She is mine. All of you are mine. You came here willingly." Daniel staggered backward, his mind screaming for him to run. But his legs felt like lead, his body numb with fear. The creature took a step forward, its smile widening, revealing rows of teeth. "This is your final resting place, Daniel. Your soul is already bound to this house. You belong to us now." The words sent a shiver down his spine. It was true. He could feel it in his very soul. He was no longer the man he had been when he first entered the house. This place had claimed him, twisted him, made him part of its nightmare. "No!" Daniel cried out, but it was no use. The creature was upon him before he could even attempt to flee. A cold hand, like ice, clamped onto his arm. The pressure was unbearable. He tried to break free, but the grip tightened, sinking into his flesh. His screams were swallowed by the darkness as the creature pulled him forward, drawing him closer to Grace's lifeless form. "We are waiting," the creature whispered, its voice full of hunger and malice. "We have always been waiting." In that moment, Daniel realized the terrible truth. This house had never been empty. It had been waiting for him, for Grace, for their souls to become part of its eternal nightmare. The faces, the whispers, the shadows, they had all been calling out for him, for her, and now that they were here, there was no escape. The figure of Grace finally stirred, her lips curling into an agonizing smile as she stepped forward, but it wasn't her anymore. Her body moved mechanically, stiffly, her eyes still empty. She reached for Daniel's hand, but as her fingers brushed his skin, he could feel her coldness, like the touch of death itself. "We never leave," Grace's voice rasped, but the words sounded hollow, empty. "Once you come here, you belong to this place." Her grip tightened on his wrist, and Daniel felt his body growing weaker. He could feel the energy draining from him, like a thread being pulled from his very being. His vision began to blur. The room spun around him, and just before the darkness fully overtook him, Daniel whispered one last word, one last plea, "Grace." But the words never reached her. Chapter 6. The House's Hungry Gaze. The darkness pressed in from all sides, suffocating and relentless, as Daniel's mind tried to grasp what had just happened. His body felt as if it were being crushed under the weight of 1,000 invisible hands. He was no longer sure if he was still alive. Perhaps he was already dead. Grace's cold, lifeless fingers still clung to his wrist, dragging him forward with an unnatural force. Her touch was like the brush of death itself, sending icy tendrils through his veins. Each step she took, her movements stiff and jerky, were like echoes of a forgotten time, a time before the house had claimed her, before it had corrupted her into something other. Daniel's thoughts spun, frantic, but they were heavy, muddled, and slow, as if they were being smothered by the very air in this place. The words he wanted to speak, The screams of terror clawing at his throat died before they could leave his lips. His chest was tight, his breath ragged, but the air was cold, thick with something that made breathing feel like a laborious task. Suddenly, the floor beneath him seemed to shift. The solid wooden planks that had once creaked and groaned with age now seemed to bend, as if they were alive, reacting to his every move. The house, this cursed malevolent thing, was aware of him. It was watching him, and it wanted something. Grace, or whatever remained of her, did not speak again. She only dragged him deeper into the house, her once familiar face now an empty, pale mask of what she had been. The further they went, the more the shadows seemed to close in, thick and black like ink spilling from the walls, swallowing the light whole. Each corner they turned, each narrow hallway they passed, felt like a journey deeper into hell. Daniel's heart pounded in his chest, every beat growing louder, more frantic, as if the house itself was feeding on his fear. The whispers, low and insidious, started again, winding through the air like serpents. He couldn't make out the words, but their meaning was clear. You are lost. You are ours. The walls felt alive, pulsating with a rhythm that seemed to come from within them, as though the house had a heartbeat of its own. The temperature dropped with every step, the cold gnawing at his bones until he could no longer feel his fingers or toes. His limbs were heavy, his body aching, as though he were walking through a nightmare where the laws of nature had been shattered. Grace halted abruptly in front of a door. She turned slowly, her face still a mask of emptiness, her eyes now completely black, voids where once there had been warmth. She gestured to the door with a slow, deliberate motion. Daniel felt the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. He knew, without a doubt, that whatever lay beyond that door was the heart of the nightmare, the source of the evil that had claimed Grace, and perhaps now, him too. He tried to step back, to break free of her grip, but the house had already claimed him, its tendrils sinking deep into his soul. His legs refused to move. Every inch of his body screamed to flee. But he was trapped in this place, like a fly caught in a spider's web. His vision blurred, his breath shallow, as if the house itself was sucking the life from him, feeding off his terror. Grace's voice, cold and emotionless, echoed in the silence. It is time. The house is hungry. Without another word, she twisted the door handle and pushed it open. A rush of air, thick and foul, spilled out from the crack, carrying with it the stench of decay and something far worse. The room beyond was shrouded in darkness, the kind of darkness that swallowed everything whole, devouring light, hope, and sanity. Daniel's heart raced. He knew he had no choice but to follow, to walk into the waiting jaws of whatever horrors awaited him. But the moment he crossed the threshold, something inside him, something primal and instinctive, screamed no. The door slammed shut behind him, and the room fell into an oppressive, suffocating silence. There was something in the room. Daniel's breath quickened, panic rising in his chest as his eyes struggled to adjust to the near-total darkness. He could make out vague shapes, a shadow here, a silhouette there, but nothing more. The room was vast, larger than it should have been, stretching impossibly in all directions, as though the very walls had been contorted by some invisible force. A soft, whispering sound began to rise from the depths of the darkness. It was the sound of something moving, scraping, and it was coming closer. His pulse raced. A figure slowly emerged from the shadows, its form undulating, as if it were made of shifting smoke or liquid. It was tall, unnaturally tall, its limbs long and stretched. The creature's body seemed to be composed of writhing shadows, its edges indistinct, as though it were constantly changing shape. A sickly, pale light emanated from within it, casting long, grotesque shadows that danced around the room like tendrils of death itself. And then it spoke. You have come to feed us. The voice was deep, guttural, yet eerily melodic, impossibly smooth, as if it were both a whisper and a roar all at once. The house has been waiting, and now you are here. You are ours. Daniel's knees buckled beneath him, and he fell to the cold, hard floor. The house, the thing that lived, had been waiting for him, for Grace, for everyone it had trapped. It was feeding on their fear, on their souls, and there was no escape. The shadows around him seemed to close in, moving with a life of their own. They coiled and twisted, forming shapes that were impossible to comprehend. Figures that were half human, half nightmare. They crawled across the floor, slithered up the walls, and gathered above him like a cloud of malevolent insects. His breath was ragged, his pulse thundering in his ears as he stumbled to his feet. He had to get out. He had to escape. But the house was everywhere, in every crack, every corner, every inch of this godforsaken place. It was alive, and it had taken him. A sharp pain shot through his chest, and he gasped for air. The house was consuming him, piece by piece, devouring him from the inside out. His vision swam, dark spots dancing before his eyes as the shadows pressed against his skin, suffocating him. "You are no different from the others," the creature's voice echoed, its form growing closer, its features becoming more defined. It was humanoid, but its face was a hideous mask of agony and hunger. "You will remain here, feeding us, forever." Daniel's mind screamed for release, for mercy, but there was none. The darkness had already claimed him. It had claimed Grace. It had claimed everyone. And now it was his turn. Chapter 6. The House's Hungry Gaze continued. The shadows closed in, their presence suffocating and thick, their whispered voices a cacophony of sinister promises. Daniel could feel them crawling over his skin, slipping into the crevices of his mind. He tried to scream, but the sound died in his throat, choked off by the weight of the darkness around him. It wasn't just the air that was suffocating him now. It was the house itself, breathing, living, pulsating with a hunger that made his very bones ache. The creature, or whatever it was, loomed above him, its monstrous form shifting like a mirage. Its features were indistinct, constantly morphing, as if it had no true shape of its own. The thing was a blur, an amalgamation of twisted limbs, grotesque faces, and black, writhing tendrils that slithered through the air like serpents. And its eyes, those impossibly hollow, pitch-black eyes, seemed to consume everything they touched, everything they gazed upon. They fixed on Daniel now, unblinking, unfeeling, as if they were part of the house itself, searching for something it knew would be consumed. Daniel couldn't look away. "You have come to feed us," the voice whispered again. But this time, it was different. There was no melody in it now. It was cold, guttural, as though it were emanating from somewhere deep inside the earth, from a place untouched by light, untouched by time. "You are the final course, the one we've waited for. And now..." The creature's form shuddered violently, and the shadows around it began to move. They shifted, undulated like living things, pulling toward Daniel as if drawn by an invisible magnet. He felt their touch before he even saw them. Cold, clammy hands brushing against his face, fingers winding through his hair, snaking their way around his limbs. He tried to move, to fight, but his body was paralyzed, frozen in place by the weight of the house's gaze. It had been feeding on him, feeding on his fear for what felt like an eternity. It had been eating him from the inside, gnawing away at his will, his thoughts, his very soul. He was no longer sure where the house ended and he began. Grace's cold, empty eyes flashed in his mind, the last image of her before she had changed into one of them, the thought of her twisted face, the hollow expression that had overtaken her, almost broke him. But what had happened to her? What had turned her into this thing? It was happening to him too. The house had claimed her, and now it was trying to claim him. The ground beneath him shuddered, the floorboards creaking like an old man's bones, and for a moment, Daniel thought he might fall through, that the house would swallow him whole, send him tumbling into the abyss beneath its foundations. But that didn't happen. Instead, the walls groaned, and a low guttural rumble echoed through the room as the shadows began to press in on him from all sides. The temperature dropped even further, the cold now biting, scraping at his skin like nails on chalkboard. He could hear the whispers now, clear and distinct, crawling inside his head like insects. "You will stay, you will serve, you will become one with us, forever." The air was thick with the stench of rot, of something decaying, of something that should have been dead long ago but wasn't. It smelled like the very essence of death itself. a fetid, suffocating miasma that clung to his nostrils, making him gag. Suddenly, a figure stepped forward from the shifting shadows, a figure that was impossibly tall, its limbs stretching unnaturally. It wasn't Grace. Not anymore. But there was something familiar in the figure's gaze. Its face was a perfect, smooth mask of skin, its eyes two hollow voids, empty and cold, its mouth stretched wide into an unnatural grin, lips peeling back to reveal teeth that were too sharp, too many. It stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate, like a predator closing in on its prey. Daniel's pulse quickened, his heart hammering in his chest. His mind screamed for him to move, to run, but his legs wouldn't respond. His body refused to obey. The figure's voice, dry and rasping, echoed through the room. "You are the last piece, the final sacrifice. Once you join us, you will understand. The house consumes, it takes everything, until there's nothing left but the hunger. The endless hunger. The house. It had always been the house. The walls, the floors, the very air. It was all part of it. The house had been alive, breathing, feeding, and now it wanted him to join its feast. "Join us," the figure whispered, its voice now a faint echo, like a memory trying to claw its way to the surface. "We are eternal. We never leave. We never die." Daniel's mind raced. He had to fight. He had to escape. But his body felt as though it was being slowly consumed, piece by piece, by the house, by the darkness. His thoughts were clouded, disjointed, as if they were slipping away from him, lost to the suffocating pressure of the house's malevolent presence. And then, as though on cue, the walls began to close in around him. The room itself seemed to shrink, the corners folding in on themselves, the ceiling lowering, the floor shifting beneath his feet. The house was alive, a living entity, and it was consuming him, pulling him into its depths, forcing him to become part of it, part of the never-ending hunger. He tried to scream again, but his voice was drowned out by the oppressive silence that had settled in the room. The only sound now was the soft rhythmic thumping of his own heartbeat, thudding in his chest like the ticking of a clock, counting down to an inevitable, horrifying end. And then, it was as if the house opened up to him, the shadows parting like a curtain, revealing something far worse than he had ever imagined. He couldn't see it clearly, but he could feel it, the presence of something ancient, something powerful, something that had been waiting, feeding, and growing inside the house for centuries. It was alive, it was aware, and it was waiting for him to become one with it. Suddenly, Grace's face flashed before his eyes once more, her cold, empty gaze. She was not lost. Not gone. She had become the house. She had become the hunger. And now, Daniel knew with sickening certainty that he would too. "The house is waiting for you," Grace's voice echoed through the darkness, distorted and hollow. "We are waiting." And then, everything went black. Chapter 7. The Final Feast. The blackness that swallowed Daniel seemed endless. His consciousness flickered in and out like a dying flame, snuffed out by the crushing weight of the darkness pressing in on him. It wasn't just the absence of light that overwhelmed him, but the presence of something much worse. The house itself, alive, ravenous, and all-consuming, had begun its work in earnest. It had claimed him, body and soul, and now it was feeding, not just on his fear, but on his very essence. He couldn't remember how long he had been in this limbo, but the cold had settled deep into his bones, chilling him from the inside out. His limbs felt heavy, unresponsive, as though they were no longer his own. His thoughts were disjointed, slipping like water through his fingers. The hunger in his mind gnawed at him, twisting his memories into strange, fragmented pieces. It was as if the house itself had infiltrated his thoughts, weaving itself into his very being, so that he could no longer distinguish between what was real and what was just another phantom of the house's making. But then, amidst the cold void and the oppressive silence, something shifted. There was a flicker of light. It was faint at first, a soft glow, barely perceptible, but it grew brighter, more insistent, until the walls of the house itself seemed to pulse with a sickly greenish hue. Daniel's body jerked involuntarily, his senses reawakening, and he tried to move, to cry out, but his mouth refused to obey. The house's grip on him had tightened, every muscle in his body seized, leaving him a prisoner within his own flesh. A voice echoed through the darkness, a voice he recognized. Daniel. It was Grace. Her voice was faint, like a distant whisper carried on the wind, but it was unmistakably hers. The sound of it filled him with dread, but also with a strange yearning, as though a part of him, some small, desperate part, longed to reach out to her, to hold her, to make things right. But he knew better than to hope. He knew what had become of her. You've become one of them, she whispered again, her voice distant, hollow. You've become part of the hunger, the never-ending feast. His heart pounded in his chest, a frantic rhythm that matched the rising crescendo of the house's malevolent hum. The air grew thick, heavier, as though the very space around him was alive, breathing with the same hunger that filled the walls. No, Daniel thought, his mind screaming against the suffocating silence. I am not like them. I am not a part of this. But the words were futile. They faded before they could even leave his mind, swallowed by the darkness. The hunger was everywhere now, all around him, inside him, gnawing at his sanity. The walls seemed to shift, closing in on him, contracting with each breath. The house was a living, breathing organism, and he could feel it, could feel its pulse, its hunger, coursing through him like a fever. Grace's voice came again, clearer now, more forceful. You're already here, Daniel, she said, and this time, her words didn't carry the sadness or the longing that had once marked them. There was only coldness now. You've been here all along. We've been waiting. And then he felt it. A pull, unseen, invisible, yet undeniable. His body was being drawn toward something, toward the heart of the house, where the darkness was thickest, where the air felt colder than the deepest winter. It was calling him, urging him to surrender, to give in, to let it consume him completely. He could feel it, something in the center of the house, just beyond his reach, something ancient, something that had been waiting for him, for all of them, for as long as the house had existed. And then, like a door swinging open, he knew, he understood. The house was not just a dwelling, it was a prison for souls, for lost ones, for those who had been consumed by the hunger, forced to feed the insatiable appetite of the house. It had been waiting for him, just as it had waited for Grace, for everyone who had ever entered its doors. It wanted him. It needed him. He was part of its endless feast, a never-ending cycle of consumption, of loss. But it wasn't over, not yet. His eyes opened, and he found himself standing in the heart of the house. It was a vast, cavernous space, far larger than the house's exterior had suggested. The walls, if they could even be called walls, were composed of what appeared to be living flesh, rippling and shifting as though they were breathing. The floor was slick, the stone cold beneath his feet, but it was the ceiling, if it could even be called a ceiling, that held his gaze. It was a mass of tangled roots and tendrils, stretching upward, disappearing into the endless dark above. At the center of the room, there was a large, grotesque altar. The altar seemed to be made from the very bones of the house itself, twisted and contorted into unnatural shapes. It pulsed with an eerie, unnatural glow, and the air around it hummed with an oppressive energy. Daniel felt his legs move, no longer of his own volition, as if something, someone, was guiding him forward. The house's power was undeniable, and he was caught in its grip, unable to resist, unable to break free. When he reached the altar, he saw them, the others. Their faces were familiar, and yet they were not. Some were people he recognized, family members, friends, while others were strangers, their faces twisted with a horrible expression of agony, frozen in time as though they had been trapped here for centuries. Their eyes were hollow, their bodies gaunt and twisted, yet they stood motionless, bound to the altar in some way Daniel could not yet understand. Their mouths hung open, as if in a silent scream, and their hands were pressed against the stone as though they were reaching for something just out of their grasp. But then he saw it, the final piece. Grace stood there too. Her eyes were empty, just like theirs. But her mouth was different. It twisted into a smile, one so grotesque and wrong that it sent chills down his spine. You see now, don't you, Daniel? she whispered, her voice no longer her own. It was cold, void of all humanity. We've all become a part of it, a part of the hunger, and now, it's your turn. Daniel tried to step back, to run, but it was too late. The house had him. The altar was pulling him in, the tendrils of shadow reaching for him, wrapping around his legs, his arms, dragging him toward the heart of the feast. And with that final desperate scream, Daniel was pulled into the abyss. Chapter 8. The hollow echoes of the past. Daniel's scream echoed through the void, but there was no sound. The darkness consumed him, pulling him deeper into its insatiable maw, as though it had always been there, waiting for him to come, for him to fall into its grasp. The very air around him seemed to press in on him, thick with the weight of unseen things, things that existed only in the corners of his mind, lurking just beyond the reach of reason. His limbs were numb, but his mind was wide awake, racing, desperately trying to find some way to escape the relentless grip of the house. But the house, it had already claimed him. The final tendril of shadow wrapped around his body like a vice, constricting his chest. His heart pounded in his ears as the cold seeped through his skin, clawing its way into his bones. He could feel his body shifting, changing, as though something deep within him had been awakened by the presence of the house's hunger. He felt as though he were being pulled apart, his very essence torn asunder by the forces that had been unleashed upon him. But there was no escape, no way out. As the darkness continued to consume him, Daniel's mind fragmented. The images came, flashes of his past, of the life he had lived before the house. He saw the faces of his family, his wife, his children, his friends. He saw himself as a child, running through fields of grass beneath a bright blue sky. He saw Grace, standing beside him, her eyes filled with laughter, her voice light and full of life. But then the images began to twist. The fields of grass turned to ash, the sky blackened with smoke. His childhood home, once so full of warmth and light, was now a crumbling ruin. The faces of his loved ones contorted, their eyes wide with fear, their mouths open in silent screams. The laughter of Grace turned to a hollow, empty sound, reverberating in his ears like the rattle of bones. Daniel wanted to scream again, but the sound was swallowed by the oppressive silence, by the darkness that had become his world. And then, as if summoned by his thoughts, the figure appeared. It was Grace, but not the Grace he had known. This Grace was different. Her body was gaunt, her skin pale and stretched tight over her bones. Her eyes were hollow, devoid of all warmth, and her mouth twisted into a smile that was anything but kind. She stood before him, her form flickering in and out of existence, as if she were not entirely part of this world. Her hands were raised, as though she were offering something to him, something that was both familiar and terrifying. "You should have known, Daniel," she said, her voice a mere whisper, a breath against his ear. "You were always a part of it. You always belonged here." Her words twisted around him, wrapping themselves around his mind like a shackle. He tried to pull away, to resist, but there was nowhere to go. He was trapped in this endless void, surrounded by the hollow echoes of his past, by the ghosts of those who had already fallen prey to the house. "I didn't want this," he gasped, his voice trembling, barely audible in the thick silence. "I didn't want to be part of it. I tried to save you. I tried to get us out." Grace's face flickered again, and for a moment, Daniel could see the person she had once been. The woman he had loved. The woman he had lost, but it was fleeting, gone in the next instant, replaced by the hollow, empty shell that the house had made of her. "You never had a choice, Daniel," she said, her voice colder now, almost mechanical. "None of us did. The house doesn't let us choose. It feeds, it takes, and we become part of it." Daniel's heart raced, his pulse pounding in his temples as the weight of her words sank in. He wanted to deny it, to push it away, but the truth was undeniable. The house was not just a building. It was something far older, far more powerful. It was a force that had been feeding on souls for centuries, trapping them in a never-ending cycle of hunger and despair. And now it had claimed him. I'm sorry, he whispered, his voice breaking. I never should have come here. The house seemed to react to his words, the air growing colder, the darkness pressing in tighter. His limbs began to tremble, his body convulsing with the intensity of the house's power. He could feel it now, the hunger, the need to feed, to consume, to become part of the house's eternal cycle. Grace stepped forward, her eyes locked on his, her face a mask of sorrow and pity. You're one of us now, Daniel, she said, her voice filled with an eerie calm. There is no turning back. We're all here, trapped. And soon you will be like us, waiting, yearning, feeding the hunger that has claimed us. As her words sank into his mind, Daniel felt a sudden, sharp pain deep within him. It was as though something inside his chest had shattered, and the darkness flooded in. His body convulsed again, and for a moment he thought he might die right then and there, his life snuffed out by the insatiable force that had been feeding on him. But the pain didn't stop. Instead, it grew stronger. His vision blurred, and he heard the whispers again, voices calling to him from the darkness, from beyond the veil. Their words were indistinguishable, a cacophony of agony and desperation, all begging for release, for freedom from the house's clutches. Daniel couldn't understand them, couldn't make sense of their cries, but the sensation was overwhelming. It was as though he were being pulled into the depths of the house, into the very heart of its hunger. And then he saw it. In the distance, through the fog of pain and darkness, he saw a faint glow, a light, small and flickering, but there nonetheless. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Hope. The thought caught him off guard. Hope? After everything he had witnessed? After the horrors that had unfolded around him? But still, he reached for it, as if it were his only lifeline. His legs felt weak, but he forced himself to stand, to move, driven by that fragile, flickering light. His every step felt like it was dragging him deeper into the house, yet somehow he couldn't stop himself. He had to keep moving. There was something there, something beyond the reach of the hunger, something that could offer him a chance at escape. But the house was watching. The darkness shifted, the walls around him groaning, stretching. A cold laugh echoed from every corner, a voice that was not Grace's but something darker, something far more ancient. You think you can escape, Daniel? The voice crooned, its tone mocking, dripping with malice. There is no escape. The house owns you now. And as Daniel stumbled forward, desperate for that light, he felt it. A tug, a pull, like an invisible hand gripping his chest, dragging him back. The darkness was closing in. He reached out, his fingers brushing the light, and for a moment, he thought he had made it, that there was a way out, that there was hope after all. But the light flickered once, twice, and then it vanished, and with it, all that he had left. The house's laughter filled the air, a cruel, mocking sound that reverberated in his soul, making his blood run cold. Chapter 9. The Unraveling. The world was quiet now. Too quiet. Daniel's heartbeat thudded painfully in his chest, reverberating against the stillness. The darkness pressed in around him, a suffocating, all-encompassing weight. It had been there for so long, creeping into his soul, until there was nothing left but the oppressive silence and the distant, mocking laughter of the house. It had been days, weeks perhaps, since he had last seen Grace. She had vanished, swallowed whole by the house, her final words ringing in his ears. There is no escape, Daniel. Her voice had become an echo in his mind, a haunting reminder of what he had lost. But now, there was something else. He felt it in his bones, the subtle shift in the air. The house, this living, breathing entity, was watching him. It was always watching, always waiting for the moment when he would finally break. It had broken everyone before him, and now it was his turn, his time. The floor beneath him creaked, as though the house itself were shifting. The walls groaned in protest, the ceiling above him rumbling ominously. Daniel shivered, but he couldn't stop moving. There was no point in trying to hide. He had learned that much in this nightmare. You couldn't escape it. You could only survive in the fragments of your sanity that remained. Suddenly, A low whisper filled the air, drifting just beyond the edges of his hearing. It was a voice, soft and melodic, but tainted with something wrong. Something twisted. Daniel strained to hear it, but it slipped away, just out of reach, like the remnants of a forgotten dream. "Daniel!" the voice cooed, a hushed murmur that seemed to come from every corner at once. "You've been so patient, so very patient." He froze, his breath catching in his throat. The voice, he recognized it. It was hers, Grace. He turned, his gaze darting through the shadows, searching for the source. The house seemed to pulse with life, the shadows stretching and distorting like fingers trying to reach out and touch him. A cold wind swept through the corridor, swirling around him, tugging at the edges of his consciousness. It was as though the very walls were alive, alive with a hunger he could feel in the pit of his stomach. He felt it now, the pull. The house was calling him, drawing him deeper into its web. Daniel staggered forward, his legs shaking with exhaustion, but something in him, something deep, something primal, refused to stop. There was no going back now. He had come this far, and to turn away now would mean surrender. It would mean allowing the house to claim him fully, to swallow him whole. He couldn't allow that, but the more he walked, the more he was drawn into the house's labyrinthine heart. The halls seemed endless, twisting in on themselves, leading him in circles, each step taking him farther into the dark void that seemed to stretch out forever. As he walked, the air grew colder, colder and wetter. The walls around him became slick with condensation, beads of moisture dripping from the ceiling like the tears of the house itself. A foul stench began to fill his nostrils, a sour, decaying odor that made him gag. And then, in the distance, he saw it. A flicker of light. It was faint, a small candle flame, but it was there. Daniel's heart skipped a beat. And for a moment, he allowed himself to believe that this might be it, that this was the way out, the escape he had been searching for. He moved towards it, his feet faltering, as if the house itself were trying to stop him. The shadows reached out, claws of darkness grasping at his ankles, but he pushed forward, determined. The light grew brighter as he got closer, revealing a door, an old wooden door, its surface weathered and cracked with age. The door seemed familiar, though he couldn't place where he had seen it before, but he knew that beyond it lay something important, something he had to see, had to know. He reached for the handle, his hand trembling as it made contact with the cold metal. The moment his fingers brushed it, the door creaked open, as if it had been waiting for him, eager to reveal whatever lay beyond. What he saw on the other side made his stomach lurch. The room was different. It was not the same as the other rooms of the house. The air was still, almost suffocating, but there was something more. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, faded and stained with age. Dust hung in the air, thick and oppressive, and the floor was littered with old, broken furniture. But the strangest part of the room, what made Daniel's blood run cold, was the mirror. It stood in the far corner of the room, an antique mirror, framed in ornate gold. The glass was cracked, the edges darkened with age, but it gleamed nonetheless, catching the faint light from the hallway and reflecting it in an eerie glow. And standing before the mirror was a figure. At first, Daniel thought it was Grace, but as he stepped closer, his stomach twisted with horror. The figure was not Grace, it was him. He stared at his own reflection, his breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps. The man in the mirror was not the Daniel he recognized. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow, sunken deep into his skull. His hair was unkempt, matted with something dark, a thick, almost viscous liquid that dripped down his forehead like blood. His skin was pale, stretched tight over his bones, as if he had been starved for years. And then the reflection smiled, a slow, wide grin that wasn't his own. The smile was twisted, filled with malice, filled with something hungry. "You're still here, Daniel," the reflection whispered, its voice a distorted echo of his own. "Still playing the game, still trying to escape." Daniel stumbled backward, his heart racing as panic surged through him. He wanted to scream, wanted to run, but his body wouldn't obey. He was frozen, trapped in the gaze of the reflection, unable to look away. "You can't escape," the figure continued, its smile growing wider, more grotesque. "You never could. The house has you now, just like it has me." The words cut into him like a blade. They were true. The reflection, his reflection, was not just a vision of the past or a trick of the mind. It was him. It was what he was becoming, what the house had made him into. He could feel it now, the slow, creeping realization that there was no way out. The house had already consumed him. And the longer he resisted, the more it would strip away what was left of him. His memories, his identity, his soul. The reflection's laughter echoed in his ears, a hollow, broken sound. It was him, laughing. But it wasn't him at all. It was the house, and it was hungry. Daniel fell to his knees, his hands gripping the floor as the room around him began to spin. His head swam, the voices in his mind growing louder, the walls pressing in. The hunger gnawed at him, pulling him in, dragging him into the darkness. The house had won. Chapter 10. The Final Breath. The reflection in the mirror seemed to breathe with him, its chest rising and falling in a mimicry of his own, but not quite in sync. It was wrong. The way it moved was all wrong. Every time his chest expanded, the figure's ribs stretched too wide, cracking like brittle wood. Each exhalation of his own breath was echoed in a sound too deep, too cavernous, too distant to belong to his lungs. Daniel wanted to scream, but the air had been squeezed out of his chest, leaving nothing but the sickening pressure of inevitability. The room seemed to close in around him. The walls groaned and the floor beneath his feet trembled. He could hear the sound of something dragging across the floor, scraping slowly and relentlessly. A sound that scratched against the very fabric of his sanity. Something was moving behind him. Slowly he turned, his body stiff, as though every movement were a battle against the weight of 1,000 years pressing against him. The room was as dark as a tomb, the faint light from the hallway barely breaking through the suffocating gloom. The source of the sound became clear then. The darkness in the corner of the room swirled, twisting and curling like smoke from a forgotten fire. From the void, a figure stepped forward, its form barely solid, more shadow than flesh. A tall silhouette, its features obscured by the darkness, but Daniel could feel it. It was watching him. His heart pounded harder now, almost painfully, his pulse thrumming in his ears like a drumbeat. Every instinct he had screamed for him to flee, to escape, but there was nowhere to run. The figure spoke, its voice a rasp, as if its throat had been scraped raw by centuries of silence. "I've been waiting for you, Daniel," it whispered, the words slithering like worms in the dirt, cold and insidious. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The figure's voice had anchored him to the spot, its cold breath chilling him to the bone. "You don't need to fear me," the figure continued, stepping forward, its movements unnaturally slow, deliberate. "You've already become one of us." Daniel's eyes widened. The words struck him like a slap to the face, and for a moment, his mind refused to understand them. He couldn't have become like the thing standing before him. "You think you're still human," the figure hissed. "But the house doesn't care about that. It consumes you piece by piece. Every moment you're here, you lose more of yourself. You think you still have control? That you can resist?" It took another step, and this time Daniel saw the face beneath the shadows. It was a face like his, but it was twisted, decayed, pale with sickness. The eyes were hollowed out, black as pits, unblinking. It was the same face he had seen in the mirror. "You are me," it said with a grin that split its face like cracked porcelain. "You've already surrendered to the house. It's too late to turn back now." Daniel's stomach twisted violently. His hands trembled uncontrollably, and his breath became ragged as the weight of the figure's words crushed him. It was true. The house had already taken so much from him. His memories were fading. His sense of self, what little remained of it, was slipping away like sand through his fingers. "There's no escape," the figure said again, its voice softer now, almost affectionate. "We're all trapped here. We're all pieces of it. You'll never leave. And soon, you won't want to." Daniel's legs gave way, and he collapsed to the floor. His hands reached out to steady himself, but the touch of the cold wood sent a jolt of panic through him. It felt wrong. His fingers curled into the grain, and as he did, the wood splintered and cracked like brittle bone. The laughter began again, low and cruel. It was everywhere now. It echoed through the walls, through the very air he breathed, wrapping around him like a shroud. The house itself seemed to be laughing with them, a laughter that reverberated in his chest, in his bones. "You belong to it now," the figure whispered, leaning closer. "You always have." Daniel's throat tightened, his vision blurred. He could feel his sanity beginning to unravel, the edges of his mind fraying like old fabric. The weight of the house's malevolent presence pressed in on him, a crushing pressure that suffocated him from all sides. His thoughts became fragmented, splintered like broken glass. He couldn't focus, he couldn't think. All that was left was the laughter, the darkness, and the cold touch of the house's grasp. And then a shift. Something deep inside him stirred. A flicker of resistance, a faint spark of the man he used to be, of the hope he had once clung to, now flickering in the depths of his soul like a dying candle. But it was too weak, too fragile to survive in this place, too fragile to survive in its grip. But that flicker, that tiny flame, was enough. Daniel didn't know how, but he fought. He pushed against the shadows, against the darkness that sought to consume him. It wasn't much. It was nothing more than a weak, desperate push against a wall that would never move. But it was enough to break the illusion, just enough to crack the facade of the house's control. The laughter grew louder, more shrill, as if the house itself was trying to pull him back, to drag him deeper into the abyss. "No!" Daniel gasped, his voice hoarse, broken. "I won't be you. I won't be part of this." But the figure only smiled, and it was a smile that made his blood freeze in his veins. "You already are," it said softly. "You already are." Daniel's chest tightened as the house's power surged through him, threatening to drown him in its suffocating presence. The air around him was thick with the weight of it, and he could feel his heart begin to slow, his breath growing more shallow. But just as his vision blurred, just as he felt his consciousness begin to slip away, a final thought cut through the haze. Was it too late to save himself?